After my billionaire grandpa died in a horrific accident, his lawyer dropped a bombshell. I was named the sole heir to his $7 billion fortune. My parents and brother exploded in rage, demanded I hand it over, and when I refused, they kicked me out that very night. With nothing but a suitcase and a key he once pressed into my hand, I drove to his mansion. I thought I'd finally found shelter. But the next morning, when my family stormed through the gates to throw me out, they stopped cold the second they saw who was standing beside me. My name is Riven Whitlow. This is not just about money, it's about betrayal, survival, and the last gift from the only man who ever believed in me. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If my story touches you, please subscribe to this channel. Every view, every comment, every subscription reminds me that even when your own family turns their back, strangers out there can still choose to stand with you. I was never the son my family wanted me to be. At 30, I taught piano lessons in a cramped studio downtown, scraping by on rent and secondhand groceries, while my father Graham, my mother Elaine, and my brother Trent lived in a world measured by corner offices, tailored suits, and expensive cocktails. To them, my life was a disappointment, a quiet embarrassment they tolerated but never respected. Yet, in that small studio with its pine-scented walls and the soft glow of a single yellow lamp, I found meaning in every clumsy note a child struck and every pair of small hands learning to move across ivory keys. That was my world until the night my phone rang. It was late. My last student had left the echoes of scales still hanging in the room. I sat at my desk marking finger positions on a worksheet when the number flashed across my phone. Unknown caller. I nearly ignored it. Something in my gut told me to answer. Mr. Whitlow, the officer's voice was heavy, practiced in delivering bad news. There's been an accident. Your grandfather, Harrison Whitlow, he didn't make it. The pen slipped from my hand, bleeding ink across the paper. My chest tightened. The air seemed to collapse around me. My grandfather, my anchor, my one defender, was gone. The next days blurred into black suits, cold handshakes, and the suffocating grandeur of the First Presbyterian Church in Asheville. The sanctuary smelled of lilies and polished wood. My mother barked orders at the florist, rearranging bouquets so they'd look better in photographs. My father stood stiff by the doors, whispering with a banker about accounts and transfers. Trent leaned against a column, scrolling through his phone like the whole event was an inconvenience. And I, standing alone, watched the only person who had ever believed in me lowered into the ground. I remembered his voice, soft but commanding, as he placed my hand on the piano when I was a boy. Riven, he whispered, tapping my chest. Money can buy a piano, but it can't buy music. That comes from here. Those words became my compass, even as my parents scoffed at my career. At the open casket, I placed a single white lily on his chest. My lips trembled. I'll carry it forward, Grandpa, I promise. But when I turned, I caught a glimpse of faces in the crowd: business associates, journalists, opportunists. Their whispers weren't about his kindness, his values, or his laughter. They were about the Whitlow fortune, $7 billion. The will. Next week. As I stepped down the church steps, I felt something cold in my pocket. The small brass key engraved HW, the one he'd slipped into my hand months earlier. For when you have nowhere else to go, he'd said with that cryptic smile. At the time, I thought it was just sentiment. Now I wondered if he'd seen this day coming. Two moments stuck with me that day. One was the silent nod from a woman I didn't know, a tall Latina in a gray suit who looked at me as if we shared a secret. Later, I'd learn her name, Lucia Ramos, my grandfather's COO. The second was a hushed exchange I overheard between my father and an unfamiliar man. The escrow account must be triggered early. He said there's a clause. Their voices faded, but the words rooted in me like thorns. My grandfather hadn't just left behind money. He'd left behind a plan. At the church entrance, Mason Everett, our family lawyer, leaned close. Monday, 9 a.m., Montfort Avenue, he murmured. Your grandfather left a message just for you. His voice was calm, almost protective, but in that moment I understood the first battle was about to begin. I stood on the steps clutching the cold brass key, the wind from the Blue Ridge sweeping across the graveyard. The melody of my life had cracked in half, leaving only silence and the certainty that something bigger, darker was waiting. Monday morning, the air was heavy with rain clouds pressing low over Asheville. I stood outside Mason's office on Montfort Avenue, a Queen Anne house with dark wood trim and stained glass windows that filtered the light into shards of red and gold. Inside, the smell of leather and coffee lingered. A long table was set with neat stacks of folders, and on the wall hung an old map of Whitlow logistics routes. It was the empire my grandfather had built, an empire I never expected to touch. I barely had time to breathe before the front door burst open. My father strode in like he owned the place, his silver watch snapping into place on his wrist. My mother followed, heels striking the wood floor like gunshots, pearls gleaming at her throat. Trent slouched in behind them, sunglasses on at 9 a.m., smirking as if the outcome was already decided. They sat at the head of the table, claiming their positions before Mason even spoke. Mason cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began. Henry Whitlow was of sound mind when he revised his will. He underwent independent medical evaluations, all documented. I was present for each signing. My father waved a dismissive hand. Spare us the ceremony. But Mason pressed on. He opened the folder and read, I, Henry Whitlow, hereby leave the entirety of my estate, real and financial assets, investments, and holdings valued at approximately $7 billion to my grandson, Riven Whitlow. The room froze. My stomach lurched. My mother gasped, knuckles white against the table. My father shot to his feet, the chair toppling behind him. Trent slammed his fist against the oak. What about me? What about us? This is insane. Mason didn't flinch. Mr. Whitlow anticipated this response. He made it clear this decision was deliberate. He stated that Graham and Elaine had been provided for amply during his lifetime, and that Trent's repeated failures proved he lacked the discipline to steward the fortune. He wished his legacy to pass solely to Riven. Before anyone could argue further, Mason dimmed the lights and pressed a button on a remote. A video flickered onto the screen. There was my grandfather sitting in his leather chair, eyes sharp and voice steady despite age. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. Graham, Elaine, Trent, I love you, but I cannot ignore what you've become. Greed has blinded you. You saw me as a wallet, not as a father or grandfather. Riven is different. He visits because he cares. He has integrity. He will carry my legacy with dignity. The silence afterward was crushing. My mother muttered a curse under her breath. My father accused the screen of manipulation. Trent demanded a startup fund, shouting that Grandpa had promised. But the evidence was unshakable. Finally, Mason slid a small envelope toward me, sealed with red wax and my grandfather's initials. He left this for you, Riven. To be opened only when you're alone. My fingers trembled as I pocketed it. The shouting escalated. My father's fists trembled on the table. My mother hissed about betrayal. Trent demanded capital. Through it all, I stayed quiet, watching, memorizing, letting their rage wash over me like a tide I refused to drown in. Then Mason revealed something none of us expected. There is also a codicil, a safeguard. If within 6 months of Mr. Whitlow's death, Riven signs away control of the estate, 80% of the assets will automatically bypass the transferee and instead flow into the Harrison Whitlow Foundation. In short, if coerced, the fortune will dissolve into philanthropy rather than enrich anyone else. The fury in my father's face was like fire. He planned this. He planned to strip his own son. Mason's gaze was steady. He planned to protect what mattered. And then came my grandfather's last words in the video. Riven, you will not be alone. They know where to find you. I didn't know what he meant, but I felt the weight of it like a hand resting on my shoulder from beyond. When it ended, I walked out into the damp morning. My phone buzzed. A message from my father tonight. 7 p.m. Be home to discuss. Or don't call me father again. The key in my pocket pressed sharp against my leg. The sealed letter burned in my hands. And I knew whatever came next would decide everything. Dinner that night at my parents' house in North Asheville was staged like a reconciliation, but it was nothing more than theater. The sandstone walls, the glass panes gleaming with reflected firelight, the heavy furniture polished to perfection, everything about that house spoke of power, and none of it felt like home to me. We sat at the long mahogany table. My father set down a folder, his tone deceptively calm. "Riven, let's be reasonable. Sign this transfer. In return, you'll get a 10% allowance for life. More money than you'll ever need." He slid the papers toward me with the smoothness of a man who believed the deal was already done. I opened the folder. The language was cold, clinical. My eyes caught on the clause I'd learned about only hours before the safeguard my grandfather had built. If I surrendered, the assets would bypass my family and flow into the foundation. My father thought he was cornering me. In truth, his trap was lined with my grandfather's foresight. "I'm not signing," I said, my voice quiet, but steady. Silence fell like shattered glass. My mother's face twisted, her voice sharp as a knife. "Ungrateful. After everything we gave you, private schools, lessons, a roof over your head, you dare turn your back." Trent leaned forward, sneering. "Enjoy your billions, piano boy. You'll drown in it." My father slammed his glass down on the table, the crystal ringing. "Either you sign or you leave this house tonight. You will not walk out as my son if you refuse." I rose without a word, the chair legs scraping across the stone floor. My old room was just as I had left it years ago, the blue quilt, the dusty piano trophies lined on the shelf, the recital photo of me with awkward posture and a too big bow tie. I stuffed a few shirts into a duffel, grabbed the photo of me and my grandfather by the grand piano, and tucked my music notebook under my arm. My hands shook, but my chest burned with something stronger than fear. In the garage, the smell of oil and damp concrete surrounding me, I opened the sealed letter. My grandfather's words stared back at me. "If you read this from a place that no longer feels like home, go to Seven Oaks tonight. Grant will know what to do. Do not fear the sound of cameras." My throat tightened. Even in death, he was guiding me, anticipating every cruelty they would unleash. I returned downstairs, duffel slung over my shoulder. My father stood waiting, arms folded, face carved from stone. I placed the pen back on the table, pushing the folder toward him. "I'm not signing." The front door was thrown open. Cold air rushed in. Rain hammered down outside, hissing on the stone steps. My mother's shrill voice followed me as I crossed the threshold. "You'll regret this. Family is forever. Money can't keep you warm." The door slammed behind me. I walked into the downpour, gripping the brass key in my pocket so tightly my palm ached. Through the blur of rain on the windshield, I saw the lights of the house flare on all at once. In my rearview mirror, Trent stood by the window with a phone to his ear. His mouth moved words I could almost hear. Plan A failed. What about Plan B? My gut twisted. There was more coming, something I couldn't yet see. The road shimmered under street lamps, puddles reflecting the gray sky. My tires hissed across slick pavement as I drove through Asheville's sleeping streets. The prelude I had never finished teaching a student played itself in my mind, each note incomplete, unresolved. By the time the iron gates of Seven Oaks rose ahead, the rain was a wall between the past and everything that waited for me. I slid the brass key into the lock. A heavy click echoed through the storm. The gates swung open, and I stepped into the only place that had ever felt like sanctuary and the battleground my grandfather had left behind. The drive wound uphill through oaks, dripping with rain, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. Lights glowed faintly in the windows of Seven Oaks, the estate that had once been my childhood refuge. Tonight it looked like a fortress, silent and waiting. The front doors opened before I could knock. A tall man with graying hair and a pressed suit stood in the doorway. His eyes softened when they found me. "Mr. Riven," he said with a respectful bow of his head. "Your grandfather knew you'd come tonight." It was Grant Holloway, the man who had been at my grandfather's side for decades. He led me through the grand foyer, the air rich with the scent of cedar and lemon polish. The marble floor reflected the chandelier's glow. The sitting room still carried the faint musk of wood smoke. The grand piano in the music hall sat under its velvet cover, silent as if waiting for my hands. Through the tall windows I could see the rain-slicked roses in the garden, their petals heavy with water. "Come," Grant said, his tone steady but grave. He guided me down a corridor lined with portraits of Whitlow ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow me. At the end was a steel-reinforced door. Inside, the hum of machinery filled the space, a wall of monitors casting a cold blue light every corner of the estate under surveillance. "He had this installed last year," Grant explained. "Said there would come a time when it would matter. He told me it would be family we'd need to guard against." The words struck me harder than I wanted to admit. To need cameras against your own blood. My grandfather had seen this coming long before I had. Later, I sat by the fireplace in the study, staring at the old chessboard we used to battle over on Sunday afternoons. The sealed letter weighed heavy in my pocket. I opened it again, reading every line this time. "I have left behind those you can trust. When they come, open the door for them. You are not alone." Near midnight, headlights swept across the driveway. My pulse quickened. I heard the gravel crunch and the low murmur of voices. The doorbell rang once sharp and echoing through the hall. Grant moved to the door and opened it. Standing there, rain dripping from his coat, was Mason Everett, the lawyer who had read my grandfather's will. He carried a thick folder under his arm. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a surge of something I thought I'd lost resolve. He set the folder on the table. "Your grandfather called this the safeguard file. He wanted you to have this if the family turned on you. It outlines a reserve fund independent of the estate that will cover 2 years of council security and operations. He wanted to make sure you had room to breathe before they came at you with everything they had. 2 years. My grandfather had given me a window of survival, a chance to grow into the role I hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon." Grant shifted uneasily. "There's more." He pulled up footage from the cameras. The monitors flickered, and there was Trent, my brother, slipping through a side entrance after the funeral, rifling through drawers before hurrying out again. Grant's jaw tightened. That's only part of what was captured. The rest. "It's better we hold back until the time is right." Mason leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Before your grandfather passed, he met with Judge Eleanor Price. He asked her to act as an independent overseer to make sure no challenge could strip you of what he left. She agreed. You're not standing against them alone." I sat back in the leather chair, the fire's glow painting the room in amber. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed down, but beneath it something new stirred, a line drawn, a stand taken. Mason placed a hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow others will come." He made sure of that. "But be ready. They won't wait long to strike." I looked around the mansion at the shadows that seemed to carry my grandfather's presence. For the first time since the reading of the will, I didn't feel like a man abandoned. I felt like a man stepping into a war that had already begun, armed with allies I hadn't yet met, and a legacy I couldn't walk away from. Morning at Seven Oaks carried a heavy stillness, the kind of silence that hummed in the walls like the house itself was waiting. I sat at the oak dining table, the chandelier above casting a harsh white glow across the empty chairs. Grant appeared at the door and cleared his throat softly. "Someone is here to see you, Mr. Riven." I rose, half expecting another attack, but when the door opened I saw a woman with graying hair and tired eyes that immediately filled with tears. Delia Monroe. She had been my grandparents' housekeeper for over 20 years. She set down her worn handbag and stepped forward without hesitation, wrapping her arms around me. Her voice shook. "You look so much like your mother did when she was young before she changed." Delia reached into her bag and placed 2 bound journals on the table. "These were your grandmother's. She recorded everything, every visit, every demand, every kindness." My hands trembled as I opened the first. In her looping handwriting were lines that struck like daggers. "Graham came again today asking for more money. When we refused, he shouted, called us selfish. Later, Riven arrived with soup. He stayed until Harrison's fever broke. Page after page showed the same pattern, my parents and Trent treating my grandparents like a vault while I came not for money but because I loved them. Reading it was agony. Yet each word was proof undeniable that my grandfather hadn't acted on a whim when he left me everything. By noon, another visitor arrived. Lucia Ramos, the COO of Whitlow Logistics, stood in the doorway with her laptop bag. She had been the woman who nodded at me during the funeral. She shook my hand firmly, her eyes sharp but kind. "Your grandfather trusted me to tell you this," she said, opening her computer to reveal spreadsheets and financial reports. "He refused to invest in Trent's ventures because Trent burned through millions in reckless startups. Harrison told me once, 'A fortune is not a toy.' He believed you would never let it become one." Her words steadied me. Yet they also carried weight within the company. Not everyone agreed with my inheritance. Some directors had long ties to my father. "There are people inside," she said carefully, "who will not accept you. You need to know that." Later that afternoon, Vikram Desai arrived. The family's trusted investment advisor, he carried thick binders full of records. He spread them across the table, pointing out long-term strategies Harrison had put in place. He thought 50 years ahead, Vikram explained. He diversified, protected, safeguarded every corner. He knew one day this responsibility would fall to you, and he made sure it would be sustainable. One by one, the people my grandfather had trusted came forward, each bringing proof, each handing me a piece of the puzzle. I realized what he had done. He had built a shield for me, not made of steel but of loyalty, memory, and documentation. Still, with every piece came a reminder of how deeply my family had betrayed him and me. As dusk settled over the estate, I sat alone in the study, the journals open beside me. My phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. The message was brief. "Tonight at 11, be careful in the study. Not all your allies are truly yours." A chill spread down my spine. I turned back to the journal, flipping to the final page. My grandmother's handwriting was shaky, faint. Harrison whispered that one day everything would belong to Riven, but he also warned me someone inside this very house will betray him. I stared at the words until they blurred. My grandfather's fortress suddenly felt like a cage, and the faces I had welcomed hours before seemed painted with shadows. Even in the house he'd sworn would protect me, I wasn't safe. The rain outside had grown heavier, rattling against the tall windows of Seven Oaks. I sat in the library, the journals stacked at my side, the chandelier's light throwing long shadows over the shelves. The warning from the text echoed in my head. Every creak of the floorboard set me on edge. Then Grant's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Riven, you'd better come to the security room." I followed him down the corridor, the hum of machines growing louder. On the monitors, grainy footage showed a figure climbing over the outer fence. The shape was blurred by rain, but the movement was deliberate, practiced. I leaned closer, but before I could make out a face, the feed stuttered and went black. Several cameras flickered, whole sections of footage vanishing. Mason, who had stayed late to review documents, rushed in. His eyes narrowed as he studied the frozen screens. "That doesn't just happen. Someone with access to the codes did this." His gaze swept the room. "Which means someone inside this house." My stomach sank. The warning text hadn't been paranoia, it was real. The betrayal wasn't coming from outside. It was within the very circle my grandfather had left me. That night, unable to sleep, I walked the halls of Seven Oaks. The storm roared outside, thunder shaking the windows. Halfway down the corridor, I froze. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, not mine. I turned sharply, but the hall was empty. The portraits of my ancestors stared back at me in silence. When I returned to the music hall, I stopped cold. On the piano, lit by a single lamp, lay a folder that hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a photocopy of a legal agreement stamped and signed with my name. The document claimed I had already authorized the full transfer of the Whitlow estate to my father. My chest burned with fury. The signature looked like mine down to the curve of every letter. Mason examined it under the light, flipping through comparison samples. "It's forged," he said grimly. "But whoever did this knew your hand perfectly. Look here, these strokes matched Trent's old notes almost exactly. If he didn't sign it himself, he had someone mimic your style. The implication was clear. My family wasn't just trying to force me, they were preparing evidence to drag me into court, to strip me not just of money, but of credibility. Near midnight, the phone rang. The number was blocked. I answered, my voice tight. Hello. A low, rough voice came through, almost drowned by static. If you want the truth, come to the old docks at French Broad River tomorrow morning. One of the people you trust isn't who they claim to be. The line went dead. I stood alone in the great hall, the fire spitting embers, the shadows leaping on the walls. In my hand, the forged document felt heavier than steel. Outside, the storm battered the estate, but inside it was the silence that suffocated me. I realized then that the battle I had feared with my family was no longer just a matter of blood. It had become a war of shadows, betrayal, and deception. And somewhere inside the very walls of Seven Oaks, someone was already playing against me. The French Broad River lay quiet under the gray morning sky, the air cold enough to sting my face. I parked by the abandoned dock, its wooden planks warped and slick with moss. A lone figure waited at the end, collar pulled, high hat shadowing his face. He didn't speak at first, only handed me a small USB drive. His voice, when it came, was rough, as though torn from his throat. Watch carefully. Not everyone Harrison trusted is truly loyal to you. Then he turned and disappeared into the mist, leaving me with nothing but the sound of water lapping against the posts. I drove back to Seven Oaks, every turn of the wheel heavier than the last. Grant was waiting in the study. Together we slid the drive into the projector. The screen filled with grainy footage, Lucia Ramos seated at a restaurant table across from my father. She leaned forward, sliding a folder across to him. His hand closed over it like a snake coiling around prey. The room erupted in murmurs. I felt my pulse hammering. Lucia, explain this. My voice was colder than I intended. She straightened her back, her face tight. That's not what it looks like. Harrison told me to monitor Graham's movements. That could have been a setup. Look closer. The timestamps don't even match. Before I could respond, Vikram leaned over, eyes fixed on the screen. She's right. Look here, frames spliced, pixels blurred. This was edited. Someone wanted you to doubt her. He turned to me with quiet urgency. This has Graham's fingerprints all over it. He's trying to fracture us. The room swelled with voices, accusation meeting defense, loyalty colliding with suspicion. I looked from face to face, doubt settling like smoke. Every ally my grandfather had left me now seemed under a shadow. By nightfall, the estate felt colder. As I returned to my study, something caught my eye. An envelope slipped under the door. I tore it open with shaking hands. Inside were photographs of me and Mason meeting privately in his office, grainy but clear enough to spark doubt. Across the bottom, scrawled in thick black letters, "The closest one is the most dangerous." My chest tightened. Mason had been my anchor, the one constant voice of reason. Now even that bond was under attack. I looked around the study at the faces of those who had sworn to protect me, Lucia, Vikram, Grant. None of them met my eyes. That night I sat alone at the desk where my grandfather once worked. The journals lay open, the photographs scattered across the wood, the USB still glowing in the projector. My grandfather's words echoed. You will not be alone. Yet for the first time I felt utterly terrifyingly alone. Engines growled outside the gates the following evening. From the security monitors I watched sleek black cars roll to a stop, headlights piercing the rain. Men in suits spilled out, briefcases in hand. And at the center, Graham, Elaine, and Trent, their expressions hard with intent. The great hall of Seven Oaks blazed with light when they entered, their shoes striking the marble like gunshots. My father's voice cut the air. Riven is unfit to manage the estate. We have evidence documents signed in his hand. One of the lawyers opened a briefcase, laying out the forged contract that bore my name. The paper gleamed under the chandelier, damning in its neat lines. I rose, steadying my voice, though my hands shook. That is a lie. Mason stepped forward beside me, placing the real will and its codicil on the table. The estate is protected by a clause Mr. Whitlow himself designed. If Riven signs anything under coercion, the assets dissolve into the foundation. Nothing passes to Graham, Elaine, or Trent. The opposing lawyers faltered. My father's jaw tightened, but before he could recover, my brother lunged forward, his voice cracking with fury. "Enough of this charade, this is mine, all of it." His face was red, his fists clenched, the mask of composure gone. I looked him straight in the eye. If Grandpa had believed you were worthy, he would have given it to you years ago. He saw who you really are. My mother's sobs filled the room. She clutched at my father's arm, her voice dripping with accusation. "How could you betray us like this, after everything we gave you? You've turned your back on your family." I breathed deeply, forcing calm into my words. Family doesn't hold love hostage. Family doesn't demand signatures at funerals. Grandpa chose me because he knew I would not betray what he built. For a moment, the room was pure chaos. Voices colliding, papers waved like weapons, accusations hurling through the air. Then Grant's voice rang out clear and sharp. Enough. He pressed a button and a video filled the monitors. The footage showed Graham, Elaine, and Trent rifling through drawers at Seven Oaks just days after the funeral. Their greed played out in high definition, undeniable, and raw. The doors to the hall opened. Judge Eleanor Price entered, her presence commanding silence. "This is sufficient to move forward with charges of unlawful entry and attempted misappropriation of estate property." And then Chief Marla Jennings stepped in, her badge catching the firelight. "If necessary, I'll authorize arrests on the spot." The air drained from the room. My father's face turned a dangerous shade, my mother's tears now tinged with rage, and Trent's bravado wilted into silence. They gathered their things, humiliated, but as they turned to leave, my father paused at the threshold. He stabbed a finger toward me. "This isn't over. You will pay for challenging your own bloodline." The doors slammed shut behind them, the echo rolling through the estate like thunder. My chest heaved, my hands still trembling, but I stood taller than I had before. I was no longer the son they dismissed, no longer the student scraping by. I was the guardian of Harrison Whitlow's legacy, and I had just proven that I could stand my ground. But I also knew this was only the beginning. Their retreat wasn't defeat. It was the promise of war. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to protect an inheritance that was more than money. It was a fight for truth, for loyalty, for the very meaning of family. The Asheville courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people waiting to witness the showdown that had been building for months. My family had filed suit, claiming I coerced my grandfather into changing the will. Graham, Elaine, and Trent sat at the front, their faces tight with anticipation, certain they could dismantle the truth with forged contracts and accusations. I sat beside Mason, folders stacked neatly, heart steady, but pulse quickened. Graham's lawyers moved first, laying out a crisp, forged agreement that claimed I had consented to transfer the estate. The room held its breath. I stood, my voice calm and measured. If this contract were genuine, why would the codicil activate automatically? The protective clause prevents any coerced transfer. The attorneys shifted uneasily, unable to find a counter. Grant inserted the original USB into the projector. Grainy footage filled the screen, Graham, Elaine, and Trent rifling through Seven Oaks just days after the funeral. Their greed, their disregard for law and loyalty was undeniable. The courtroom murmured, whispers and gasps weaving through the spectators. Judge Eleanor Price's gavel silenced the room. The will is valid. All assets belong to Riven Whitlow. Further actions regarding trespass and forgery are referred to the appropriate authorities. Elaine burst into tears, Trent shouted, and Graham sank into his chair, pale and defeated. The courtroom had never felt quieter. Months later, Seven Oaks was alive in a new way. Mason, Lucia, Delia, Vikram, Grant, and I gathered to inaugurate the Harrison Whitlow Foundation, $2 billion dedicated to education and community. Standing at the podium, I addressed the room. Money can buy a piano, but it cannot buy music. The real legacy is giving the next generation a chance to create their own melodies. Applause filled the hall faces, warm with gratitude and support. That evening, the oak dining table hosted a different kind of family. Friends, allies, and mentors shared meals, laughter, and stories. The bonds were chosen forged through loyalty and integrity, replacing the cold scrutiny of blood relatives. I realized family was defined not by shared DNA, but by trust and purpose. A Sunday morning found me at Riverside Cemetery placing white lilies on my grandfather's grave. "I did it, Grandpa," I whispered. The Blue Ridge wind stirred through the trees, carrying the sense of his presence, a quiet affirmation. Later in the music room, sunlight poured through tall windows onto the grand piano. My fingers touched the keys, and the prelude I had never finished played itself fully, every note resonating through the hall. A recording hidden in the room activated his voice, soft but clear. "Your music is the answer." Delia found a letter in the piano drawer written years before. "If you are reading this, it means Riven has chosen the right path." I felt the weight of his trust, the culmination of every lesson he had ever imparted. I sat back watching the Blue Ridge light illuminate the estate. The unfinished prelude of my past was now complete. It was a melody of purpose, integrity, and legacy. I whispered, letting the sound fill the room. "This is ours, Grandpa. Yours and mine." The battles were over. The estate was secure. The lesson endured: true inheritance is not money, but values